Hey guys, today we are going to be talking about the structure and the function of carbohydrates. So first off, we're going to talk about why are carbohydrates important? Well, carbohydrates are essential macromolecules for life because they really are the primary energy source in all living things. So this is what your body is going to turn to for energy, really in all of your cells. So if it's available, your body is going to use it, okay? So thinking about carbohydrates and thinking about what makes them up, they're always going to be made up of three elements. So they're going to be made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So I like to remember carbohydrates are made of CHO, okay? So there's never any nitrogen, never any phosphorus. We're only going to see carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, okay? And last week we talked about dehydration synthesis, and we talked about hydrolysis, and we said we always find these things occurring at the functional groups. The functional groups that we're going to see on a carbohydrate are going to be a hydroxyl group. So remember, that's just an OH group. And then also on our carbonyl group. So that is just a C and an O. Okay, so hydroxyl and carbonyl. So remember, carbonyl is C, double bonded to O. It's usually in the middle of the molecule. And we only see it when carbohydrates take a certain form. Okay, now every carbohydrate is going to be built from a monomer. Remember, monomers are the building blocks of our macromolecules. Okay, so the monomer of a carbohydrate is something that we call a monosaccharide. Okay. Mono, if we think about that prefix, right, it means one. So it is one thing, one subunit, one building block. And what all of our carbohydrates are made of are types of sugars, okay? So it means one sugar. And a molecule of sugar or a monosaccharide is always going to look like this. Okay, so remember, this is a line drawing. In this line drawing, we didn't necessarily put in all of our carbons, but remember that each point where these lines intersect that we don't have labeled, each of those is going to represent a carbon, okay? Now, one of the things we do when we look at carbohydrates is we give those carbons numbers, and we always start right here at this oxygen. So there's an oxygen right there in the ring, and we're gonna label our carbons really going clockwise from that oxygen. So this first carbon that we have, we call C1. This next carbon, we call C2. This next carbon here, we call C3. This one is C4, C5, and then outside of the ring, this one is C6, okay? That's going to be important because it helps us number or label the bonds and understand where the bonds occur and what makes one carbohydrate different from another. Okay. Also, notice on here, we see all of these areas where we have all of these hydroxyl groups. Our monosaccharides are covered in hydroxyl groups. All right. Every monosaccharide is going to have the same formula. So we see right here, if we were to count up every carbon, every hydrogen, every oxygen, that the formula of this would be C6H12O6, and every monosaccharide will have that formula, even if it's structurally a little bit different, okay? So we have three types of monomers. One of them is going to be a little more important for us than others, but all of them are monomers we should know. Okay, and you'll notice as we're looking at carbohydrates, and I'm going to point this out now, that every single carbohydrate is going to end in -ose. So -ose, when you see that as a suffix in a word, always means that you're looking at some type of sugar or some type of carbohydrate. Okay, so we're looking at sugars and carbs when we use that suffix -ose. Now, our primary monomer, and I'm going to put a star by this because this is the one we're going to see kind of again and again and again throughout our units, is glucose, okay? So glucose is our primary monomer, our primary building block that we find in living things. Our second one, and actually right here, this is an image of glucose. Our second one is going to be really similar, and it is called galactose. And that is this one right here. And then finally, you've probably heard of this one. This is the type of sugar we find in fruit. This is fructose, okay? So right here, fructose. All right, so you can see that they are structurally similar, all made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, but also slightly different, okay? Now, each of these monomers has the same chemical formula. We already said this before, but it's C6H12O6, okay? But even though they have the same formula, they have different structures, and that is going to make them something that we call isomers, okay? So isomers are just the science word for a structure or a molecule that has a different structure but the same exact formula or chemical formula, okay? Now, it is really important for us to know why these things are important, okay? And so when we think about the importance of these carbohydrates, the main reason, or the way we're going to talk about them the most, is we're going to talk about glucose, okay? And we're going to talk about glucose being the primary energy source of your cells, okay? It's going to be used in a process that we're going to learn about a little bit later in the year, but that process is cellular respiration. And cellular respiration, well, we did talk about it a little in ecology, right, is how our bodies make ATP. And remember, ATP is the energy source for all of our cells, okay? So it is the energy currency of our cells. If our body can't make ATP, our cells can't live, and we die, right? So we already talked about this, but a little bit of review is that monomers are always going to combine through our building reaction that we call dehydration synthesis. So regardless of the type of monomer we're looking at or the building block we're looking at, we're always going to put monomers together through dehydration synthesis, okay? And remember, the monomers that we're talking about here are the monosaccharides. Okay. When we put those monomers together, they're forming our polymer, okay? Now, remember that dehydration synthesis is our building reaction where we are removing water, so water is removed. And we are always, when we put carbohydrates together, removing our waters from our hydroxyl groups. So we're going to take an OH from a hydroxyl group on one monomer, okay? And then on the second monomer, we're just going to take the H from that second hydroxyl group. Okay, so we're using those hydroxyl groups on both monomers. Now, the type of bond that occurs is a covalent bond, but it's a covalent bond with a special name that we call a glycosidic linkage. Okay, and I'm just going to kind of put in parentheses down here. It's a type of covalent bond. Okay, so it's just the special name for a covalent bond that occurs between two monosaccharides. Okay, so I'm going to draw two monosaccharides down here. I'm going to draw two glucose molecules, and I'm just going to do a really simple drawing of these to make it a little bit easier. Okay. So I'm going to do two ring structures, and I feel like I want this to snap into place a little bit better, but my Apple Pen is not working super well. Okay, so two ring structures. Okay, guess I'll have to redraw that. And I'm going to draw in my hydroxyl group here. Okay, and I'm going to draw in my hydroxyl group here. Okay, so remember, these each have the formula of C6H12O6. okay? And when we try to put these together, we have to remove our functional groups, okay? So we're going to remove an OH from here, and we're going to remove just the H from here, okay? So we are removing our water molecule. And when we do that, we create a bond. So I'm just going to draw. That oxygen stays in the middle. Okay, so we create our bond. Now remember, this is C6H12O6 plus C6H12O6. We removed a water molecule, so when we put those together, our new formula is C12 H22O11, right? Because we got rid of that water molecule. Now, remember, if we are to do this in reverse, or were to do this in reverse, right, we would have to add a water molecule to break that bond. That water molecule would be split into an OH and an H. It would be added, and then we would have hydrolysis occur where we would be breaking that apart. Okay, so remember, dehydration synthesis and hydrolysis are really just the reverse of one another. Okay, and we removed everything from those hydroxyl groups. We're going to see this a bunch of times as we go through our carbohydrates activity that we're going to start tomorrow. All right. Now, the combination of those two monosaccharides, we already kind of put the formula up there, to one another forms a structure that we call a disaccharide, okay? Disaccharide just means two sugars, right? Remember, di is a prefix that means two. Saccharide is a term that means sugar. So these are going to be our structures that are made up of two monosaccharides, or two rings. These molecules are all going to have the same chemical formula, so I put it above. It's C12H22O11, okay? But they all have different structures, meaning, again, they're all isomers of one another, okay? So here we see three of our types of disaccharides. Okay, the first one is made when we combine a glucose monomer with a fructose monomer, and this is the most common one that we see actually probably in our food. This is sucrose. So like if you eat candy, like chocolate, things like that, most of the time the sugar that's in that food is going to be sucrose. So like when you look at a nutrition label, typically you're looking at sucrose, okay? The next one that we have is made when we put together galactose and glucose, okay? And that makes the sugar that we find in milk that some of us, like me, have an issue with. That makes up our lactose, so it's our milk sugar, okay? Some of us don't have the enzyme to break it down, which causes some digestive issues for us, okay? And finally, we have the type of sugar that we get when we put together two glucose monomers, so glucose and glucose, and that is going to be maltose. So if you've ever had like a malted milkshake, or you've eaten malted milk balls like Whoppers, like I gave out for Halloween, right? That is going to be the type of sugar that we'll see in there, okay? So most common is sucrose, but we also see lactose and maltose in our food as well. Okay, now when we have three or more monosaccharides, and typically it's way more than three or more, it's like hundreds to thousands of these rings that are bonded to each other, we form what we call a polysaccharide. Okay, and poly, we know, is a prefix that means many. And saccharide, again, means sugars, okay? And those sugars are rings, so it's many of those rings. Now, there are lots of different polysaccharides, but we have a few that are made specifically from chains of glucose, okay? And these, again, are the ones that we tend to encounter in our diet, okay? The first one is going to be starch. Starch has two different names, so there are actually two kinds of forms of starch, amylose or amylopectin. Pectin you find in like apples a lot of the times. It can be used as a thickener, but both are different forms of starch. Okay. And starch is something that you find in plants. So when you eat like bread or potatoes or things like that, they are starchy foods. And the reason that those foods are so rich in starch is because plants use starch as their form of energy storage. So they are going to store their energy in the form of starch. Okay. The next type of polysaccharide that we see that is made up of a whole bunch of glucose is going to be glycogen. And glycogen is what we find in our bodies, okay? So it is our storage form of carbohydrate that we actually find in our muscle and our liver tissue. It's going to function for us as really short-term energy storage. So our primary form of energy storage is fat, and that can sustain us for many, many days, even months. But glycogen is going to be what our body releases when our blood sugar gets a little bit low. Maybe we haven't eaten for several hours, or maybe we're working out really hard for a couple of hours. Our body's going to release glycogen. Okay, so that's our short-term form of energy. And then finally, we have cellulose. And cellulose is going to be a carbohydrate that we cannot actually digest, but we do take it in through our diet. We usually think about it as dietary fiber. It makes up our plant cell walls, so it gives our plants a ton of structure as well as strength. Okay. Animals do have a similar kind of like structural carbohydrate. We don't find it in all animals, but we do find it in animals that have exoskeletons. So if you think about like a crab, right, or a lot of insects, they've got that like really crunchy kind of exoskeleton. Like if you were to step on them, you would hear a crunch. And that's because their exoskeletons are made of a polysaccharide that is called chitin. So we as human beings do not have this type of polysaccharide in our bodies, but we do see it pretty frequently in other types of animals, okay? That is what you need to know about carbohydrates for now, and I hope that that was helpful.